Bankrupt farmer lends his horse to a young woman, unaware that she is a billionaire searching for true love. The sun rose slowly over the Nebraska plains, casting pale gold across acres of dormant wheat fields and a red barn that had seen better days. Ethan Miller stood on his porch, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on the stretch of land that once bustled with tractors and laughter. Now it sat in silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of his old horse, Jasper, in the nearby paddock. This land wasn't just soil and timber, it was legacy. His grandfather had built the first fence post with blistered hands and no money, and his father had expanded it, turning a modest farm into a thriving one. Ethan had inherited it all with pride, and then watched it crumble. The droughts, the unpredictable markets, and the unforgiving grip of loans had worn him down year by year. By now the tractors had stopped humming, and the barn doors creaked from rust instead of use. The only thing Ethan had more of than land was debt. The local bank had called again the day before. The voice on the line had been polite but firm. The foreclosure was imminent. Ethan had 30 days before the land would be auctioned off. 30 days before he would have to walk away from the only life he had ever known. He didn't have a plan. He barely had enough diesel to mow the front patch of grass anymore. Pride wouldn't let him ask for help, not from the neighbors, not from his old school friends who had moved to Omaha or Lincoln, chasing easier lives. Everyone in town knew the Millers. They knew Ethan had held on longer than most would. And they whispered, not unkindly, that maybe he was too stubborn for his own good. But Ethan didn't listen to whispers. He listened to the wind moving through the corn stalks that no longer grew. He listened to the heartbeat of the earth beneath his boots, hoping it might still love him enough to give him one last miracle. Jasper snorted from the paddock, shaking his mane. The old gelding was one of the few companions Ethan still trusted. He had raised Jasper from a colt, trained him with patience and long rides through the valley. Now they shared silence like old friends who needed no words. Ethan walked over to him, ran a hand along his neck and muttered, "What do you think, boy? Time to pack it in." Jasper only flicked an ear, non-committal as always. Ethan's days had become a blur of trying to stay busy. He fixed things that didn't need fixing, patched the barn roof for the third time in 2 months, and checked fences that hadn't seen cattle in over a year. At night, he sat with a bottle of whiskey he rarely touched, stared at the fading family photos on the mantel, and tried to remember what it felt like not to live with the weight of failure pressing on his chest. It was on one such evening, with a storm threatening the horizon and wind howling low through the fields, that Ethan first heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He stepped outside, squinting into the grey dusk, and saw a car limping up the long dirt road. It was a sleek black sedan, too clean, too foreign to belong to anyone local. It stuttered and coughed before coming to a stop near the barn. A puff of smoke rose from under the hood. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. She didn't belong here. That much was obvious from the moment she took her first step in boots that were more fashion than function. Her hair was tied back neatly, and she wore a long coat that looked expensive even under the layer of road dust. But there was something else, something in the way she surveyed the land, not with disdain but curiosity. "Evening," Ethan said, approaching her slowly, unsure of what to make of this stranger on his land. She turned to him, and her face, though unfamiliar, didn't carry the usual tightness of someone lost or afraid. Her eyes were calm, intelligent. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. My car just gave up back there. I think the radiator's shot." Ethan glanced at the smoking hood, then at the woman again. "You're a long way from anywhere." "I noticed," she said, smiling faintly. "What were you doing out here?" "I was exploring. Taking the scenic route, I guess. But now I need to get to the next town." Ethan looked past her to the horizon. Storm clouds were rolling in fast. The air smelled of wet dust and thunder. "You won't make it on foot before the storm hits." She nodded, not panicking. "I figured, that's why I came up here. I was hoping you might lend me your horse." Ethan blinked. "Jasper, if he'll let me ride him, I can pay." "No," Ethan said quickly. "I mean you. Don't need to pay. If Jasper's okay with you, he'll take you there." She tilted her head, surprised. "Just like that? Storm's coming. It'd be wrong to send you out walking." Something in his voice must have convinced her. She stepped closer to the paddock, eyes studying Jasper as if already forming a bond. The horse approached her without hesitation, and Ethan felt something twist inside him. Not fear, exactly, but the strange sensation of something beginning. The woman turned to him. "Thank you, really. What's your name?" "Lily." He nodded. "I'm Ethan." "Be careful, Lily." She swung into the saddle like she'd done it before, and as she rode off into the darkening prairie, Ethan stood by the fence, watching her silhouette fade into the horizon. He had no way of knowing that his quiet, dying world had just been set on fire by the arrival of the one person who could change everything. The wind howled like an old ghost through the prairie that night, rattling loose boards and bending the tall grasses in restless waves. Ethan stood on the porch long after Lily had disappeared into the distance, her figure swallowed by the rolling clouds and the coming rain. Jasper's silhouette became a dot on the horizon, and then nothing at all. For a moment, he felt the weight of his decision, lending the one thing he still trusted in a world that had taken so much from him. But something about Lily had made it feel right. Her voice, her presence, the steady way she'd looked at him, not with pity or curiosity, but with ease, like she belonged anywhere, and maybe nowhere in particular. Thunder cracked in the distance, low and distant at first, then sharper as the storm crept closer. Ethan checked the windows, secured the barn doors again, and brought in the remaining tools. He considered going after her, just in case, but he had seen how Jasper responded to her. The horse had followed her command, as though he'd known her for years. Ethan trusted Jasper's instincts more than his own, especially lately. Rain came hard that night, tapping against the roof in thick, steady sheets. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the farmhouse seemed louder than usual, and the storm played with his thoughts. Who was Lily? She'd said little about herself, just that she was exploring. That was odd enough. People didn't usually drive out this far, unless they had a reason. And if she was lost, she didn't act like it. Most folks who ended up on his land by accident were frantic, embarrassed, or at least talkative. Lily had been calm, almost too calm for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere before a storm. And then there was her riding, smooth, practiced. She wasn't some city woman fumbling with reins. No, she'd handled Jasper like someone who'd done it many times before. Morning came with the kind of hush that follows a storm, the air clean, the earth soaked, and the sky the soft gray of regret. Ethan stepped outside, stretching his back and glancing toward the dirt road. He half expected never to see Jasper again. But there he was, trotting steadily down the drive, Lily seated upright in the saddle, rain-damp hair tucked behind her ears, a look of contentment on her face. Jasper moved easily, as if the long ride through the night and the rain hadn't tired him at all. Lily looked just as composed, though her coat was muddy and her boots were caked with dirt. She dismounted before Ethan could say a word, patted Jasper on the neck and handed over the reins. "Thank you," she said, simple and clear. "He's remarkable." Ethan nodded, checking Jasper with a quick glance, noting the horse's calm demeanor. "He likes you, that's rare." "I like him too." Lily smiled, but it was subdued, a quiet expression that didn't give away much. "You make it into town?" She nodded. "I did. They're towing my car now. I'll have it back in a few days," they said. "You ride through the storm?" "Most of it." He looked at her, surprised. "You all right?" "Better than I've been in a long time," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Ethan didn't quite know what to make of that. She didn't speak like someone who just needed a lift, and she wasn't in a hurry to leave. He expected her to thank him, retrieve her car, and be on her way. But instead, she leaned against the fence, looking out over the fields like she had all the time in the world. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked suddenly. Ethan followed her gaze. The fields were mostly empty now, save for patches of stubborn grass and the broken outline of what used to be thriving rows of crops. "Not really," he answered. "It's not just land to me. I figured you treat it like something alive." He looked at her, curious. "What about you? You from Nebraska?" She shook her head. No, I've been living in a place where people forget what things are really worth. Out here, it's different, quieter, honest. That word sat with him for a moment. Honest? It echoed something deep in his chest, a reminder of what used to matter. Lily didn't say much more that day. She stayed long enough to help Ethan brush down Jasper and refill the horse's water. Then she said she'd be back, thanked him again, and walked the long path back to the road. Ethan watched her go, unsettled by how easily she had fit into a life so far removed from wherever she had come from. The next day she returned. No car, just her boots on the gravel and a backpack slung over her shoulder. She asked if she could help around the farm. Ethan laughed at first, not because he didn't want the help, but because he didn't believe she meant it. You want to shovel out a stable, fix fence posts, that sort of thing? I'm not useless, she said, meeting his gaze. I didn't say you were. So she stayed. She followed him through the motions, collecting feed, stacking, old hay bales, mending a gate. She wasn't strong, not like someone raised on the land, but she was determined and quick. And when she laughed, it was unfiltered, the kind of laugh that made you forget the world was broken. Each time she returned, Ethan found himself watching her more closely. She never spoke about her life before this, and he never pried. But there were signs. The way she instinctively avoided questions about her past, the way she paused ever so slightly when she saw the worn photos in Ethan's living room, a family she'd never met. And the way she looked at the land, not with the eyes of a traveler, but someone searching for something she couldn't name. That evening, as the sky burned orange and Jasper grazed in the fading light, Ethan found himself sitting beside her on the porch, silence stretching comfortably between them. Why are you really here? He asked, not accusingly, but with quiet curiosity. Lily looked straight ahead. Because I wanted to feel something real. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth lingered in the air between them, unsaid but heavy, a mystery unfolding, slow and deliberate. What he didn't know was that the woman sitting beside him, hair touched by sunset, boots muddy from his fields, wasn't just some wanderer. She was Lily Carrington, a name spoken in boardrooms and tech conventions, splashed across headlines and business magazines. The daughter of a billionaire, the face of a legacy built in glass towers and billion-dollar deals. But here, on Ethan's broken land, she was just Lily, and she wanted it to stay that way. The days that followed settled into an unusual rhythm. Lily arrived each morning just after sunrise, her boots leaving prints in the damp earth as she crossed the yard, always with a quiet greeting and sleeves rolled to her elbows. She worked with a focus that surprised Ethan. She didn't flinch at manure, didn't complain when the wire fencing sliced her gloves, and never backed away from the long hours. She didn't just help, she learned. She asked questions about soil, crop rotation, the mechanics of old equipment, and the quirks of Jasper's moods. She listened the way few ever did, not for small talk, but to understand the bones of the place. Ethan, despite himself, began to wait for her steps on the gravel. The scent of her soap after a long day, the way she'd laugh when a chicken escaped the pen or curse softly when a wrench slipped. He liked her presence, not loud or needy, but steady. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't push him to talk. She just showed up. But it wasn't just gratitude that stirred in him. It was something older, something rusted shut long ago, now creaking open. Still, he didn't ask who she really was. He didn't ask why a woman like her, polished, composed, and clearly educated far beyond anyone in these parts, had landed on his failing farm with no car, no story, and no plan. But questions found him anyway, late at night when the windows rattled and his thoughts wouldn't quiet. He'd grown up knowing the signs of people hiding things. He'd seen it in neighbors who gambled away savings, in veterans who came home different, in women who wore sunglasses indoors. Lily didn't look like someone running, but she moved like someone trying not to be caught. One afternoon, they worked on repairing a collapsed section of fencing near the western field. Lily handled the hammer awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence. As she bent to tie the wire, Ethan caught a glimpse of something beneath her sleeve, a watch, thin and sleek, glinting briefly in the sun. Not the kind of thing you'd wear to mend fences. Not here. But before he could see more, she tugged her sleeve down and kept working. He said nothing, and neither did she. Later that evening, after Lily had left, Ethan walked the perimeter alone. The fields were silent, save for the hum of cicadas and the distant call of an owl. The wind carried the faint scent of coming rain. Near the barn, something caught his eye on a trail in the dirt that didn't belong. A single footprint, lighter than his own, leading toward the side door. He followed it without much thought, more curious than suspicious. Inside the barn, the air was warm with hay and dust. Ethan checked the tack room, then the loft. Nothing out of place. But just before leaving, his boot knocked something on the floor near Jasper's stall. A small silver object. He bent down and picked it up. A cufflink. No, it was a watch, delicate and clearly expensive. The back was engraved with a short message. To Lily, from your father. Let know. One love you for your fortune. Ethan stared at it for a long time. The letters were finely etched, the kind that cost more than he earned in a season. He held it like it might burn him. The name confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Lily wasn't just wandering. She wasn't just tired of city noise. She was hiding from something or someone. The next morning, Lily arrived as usual. Ethan considered confronting her, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear that pushing too hard might shatter the fragile rhythm they'd found. Instead, he waited until they were walking together toward the pasture, the sun warming their backs and Jasper trotting behind them. You dropped something in the barn yesterday? He asked casually. She glanced at him, brow raised. Like what? He reached into his pocket and handed her the watch. This. Her face didn't change much, but her fingers tightened, slightly as she took it. Thought I'd lost this. Nice engraving. She ran her thumb over the back of it, then tucked it into her coat. My father gave it to me, long time ago. Ethan didn't press. He must care a lot. He used to. The answer was quiet, almost lost to the wind. Ethan let it hang there. They kept walking, fence stretching out before them. Why do you work here, Lily? He asked suddenly. You could be anywhere, doing anything. She didn't look at him. Maybe I got tired of being someone else's version of who I'm supposed to be. He nodded, not sure what to say. She was a mystery wrapped in calluses and gentle eyes, and the more he learned, the less he understood. But still she kept showing up. Still she fixed what she could. And still she laughed when the rooster chased her, even though she knew she didn't have to be here at all. The townsfolk noticed her too. At the hardware store, people asked who the woman was. At the diner, old-timers nudged each other when she walked in. No one was unkind, but curiosity lingered in glances and whispers. Ethan didn't offer answers. He just nodded when people asked if she was staying long, but not everyone stayed silent. One evening, as Ethan picked up supplies at the co-op, Mrs. Walker, the elderly librarian, leaned in close and said, "That girl, she's not from around here, and she's not just passing through." Ethan smiled politely. "Not many are." "She's looking for something," the woman continued. "People don't run unless they're chasing or hiding." Ethan didn't reply. He paid for the seed, tipped his hat, and left. But the words stuck to him like burrs. That night, Lily didn't come. It was the first time in over a week she hadn't shown up. Ethan waited, telling himself it meant nothing. But as the sky turned violet and the crickets took over the air, he felt the absence like a cold draft through a broken window. When she arrived the next morning, he didn't ask where she'd been. She looked the same, composed, calm, but something in her eyes had shifted. She was quieter, and when they worked, her hands moved faster, as if trying to outrun a thought she didn't want to say aloud. Ethan noticed, but he still said nothing. They were two people standing on opposite ends of a truth neither wanted to name. And just beyond the fields, trouble was already closing in. The days grew colder as autumn crept closer, the light softening and the mornings thick with fog that clung to the fields like an old memory. Ethan woke early each day, his body aching from years of labor, his mind racing with the same thoughts that had kept him up for weeks. The farm was slipping through his fingers. He knew it. The papers were signed, the bank's final warning had come, and soon there would be nothing left to hold on to but a lifetime of memories buried in the earth. He tried to push it away, tried to focus on what little he had left. But the truth kept clawing at him, relentless as the wind that rattled the windows. The auction was only days away. Each morning, Lily arrived as always, quiet and determined. The weather had changed, and the winds brought with them the scent of approaching winter. They worked in the barn together, stacking hay bales, mending fences, and cleaning out the stalls. But there was a growing tension in the air, something that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both could feel. Lily didn't talk about her past, but there was a sharpness to her now, a sense of quiet urgency that hadn't been there before. She seemed to understand more than anyone the gravity of what was happening, even though she had no real connection to the land, to the farm. Ethan caught her studying him more often than he'd like, as if weighing his every move. Her silence spoke volumes, and he found himself wondering if she knew how close he was to losing everything. He hadn't told her the full extent of it, of course. He never did. His pride refused to let him ask for help, even when it was clear he needed it more than ever. One chilly morning, when the frost still lingered on the grass, the bank's final notice arrived, hand-delivered by a young man who looked out of place in the small town. He barely looked Ethan in the eye, and when he handed over the envelope, it was as though he was delivering a death sentence. The paper was official, its words cold and uncompromising. The farm would be auctioned in 3 days. If Ethan didn't come up with the full amount by then, the land would be gone, all of it. Ethan stood on the porch, reading the letter, over and over, as if the words might change with each glance. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, pressing down harder with each breath. For a moment, he wondered if he should just pack up and leave. Go somewhere far away where the world didn't remind him of everything he had failed to hold on to. But something inside him refused to give up. He had watched his grandfather fight for this place, had seen his father pour everything into it. He couldn't walk away. Lily, who had been working in the field, saw him standing there. She knew immediately. There was something in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his hands gripped the railing that told her everything. She walked toward him, her boots crunching on the frost, her breath visible in the cold air. "Ethan." Her voice was soft, tentative, but there was no mistaking the concern in her eyes. He didn't respond at first, staring at the letter like it might disappear if he didn't acknowledge it. Finally, he folded it and stuffed it into his pocket. "It's done," he said quietly. She waited for him to explain, but he didn't. She had learned over the past weeks that Ethan wasn't one to lay his burdens bare. He carried them in silence, hoping they might somehow disappear if left alone long enough. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her tone more serious than usual. He looked at her, studying her face. There was something in her eyes, not pity, but something deeper, the kind of understanding that came only from someone who had lived through their own battles. And for a moment, he wondered if she knew more about his situation than she was letting on. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Nothing, it's too late." She didn't argue. She just nodded and looked away, her gaze drifting toward the barn, where the last of the summer crops lay rotting in the field. She hadn't known him long enough to understand the full weight of what he was facing, but she could see it. The pride, the stubbornness, the refusal to ask for help. It was written in every line of his face, in every movement of his body, but Lily wasn't ready to let him give up. Not yet. The next day she returned to the farm early, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Ethan was already working on the tractor, his sleeves rolled up, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tinkered with the engine. She watched him for a moment, then approached him slowly. "You're not giving up, are you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. He glanced up at her, his face hardening. "What's the point of fighting when you've already lost?" "You haven't lost yet," she said, her voice steady. "You still have time, you don't have to do this alone." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "You don't understand. This farm isn't just a piece of land. It's everything my family built, everything I've worked for." She knelt beside him, looking at the tractor with a focused gaze. "I understand more than you think, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it all on your own." Ethan didn't respond, his hands still busy on the machine. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the strain of trying to fix something that was beyond repair. She wanted to say more, to convince him that there was another way, but she didn't know how. She had no real answers for him. She had only her presence, her willingness to stand beside him in the quiet, the way they had both come to depend on the rhythms of the land, even in its broken state. But then, just as she was about to stand up and leave him to his work, the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the air, jarring in its suddenness. Ethan looked at the receiver for a long moment, as though he could will it to stop. But then, with a resigned sigh, he picked it up. "Ethan Miller," he said, his voice tight. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then a familiar voice. "Ethan, this is Mark Lewis from the bank." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had known this call was coming, but hearing it made the reality feel all the more final. "I just wanted to remind you, the auction is in 2 days. I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do at this point." Ethan closed his eyes, clenching his teeth. He could hear the faint sound of paper shuffling on the other end, the cold efficiency of the bank's business. "I know," Ethan replied, his voice low. "I'll be there." The line went quiet for a moment, and then Mark's voice returned, softer, almost sympathetic. "Good luck, Ethan. I'm sorry it had to come to this." Ethan slammed the receiver down, the sound sharp in the empty room. Lily had been watching him the entire time, her face a mask of concern. He turned to her, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's done, Lily. There's nothing more to say." She didn't respond. Instead, she stood up and walked toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure something out," she said quietly, though her voice didn't sound entirely convinced. Ethan didn't have the heart to tell her there was nothing left to figure out. The truth had already been written. The farm, his pride, everything he had built. It was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of willpower or hard work could change that. But still, Lily stood by him, silent and strong, offering him the only thing she could, the one thing he didn't know how to ask for: hope. The wind had a different quality that morning. It wasn't stronger, colder, wetter than usual, but it carried something with it that Ethan couldn't name. A kind of waiting, a breath held in the silence between moments. The auction loomed, just 1 day away now, and each hour seemed to crawl by with the weight of inevitability. The sun rose over the horizon like a curtain lifting on a final act, golden and defiant, lighting up fields that would soon belong to someone else. Ethan stood by the barn, arms crossed, watching Jasper graze without a care in the world. The horse didn't know the land was no longer theirs, or maybe he did, and chose not to show it. Lily arrived as she had every day, a thermos in one hand, her expression unreadable. She handed him the coffee without a word. They sipped in silence for a few moments, neither of them acknowledging the ticking clock that hung between them. She didn't ask what he planned to do, and he didn't offer answers. There was no point in pretending anymore. "I found something last night," Ethan said finally, breaking the quiet. Lily turned to him, eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver object, the same watch he had returned to her earlier, but this time he had opened the back cover again. He turned it toward her so she could read the engraving once more. "To Lily, from your father, let no one love you for your fortune." She looked at it for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she took it gently from his hand and closed it. "You already knew," she said quietly. "I knew you weren't just passing through, but I didn't know the rest." "There's not much to know," she replied, her voice calm, but Ethan heard the crack beneath it. "I was raised in a world where everything had a price. People smiled with their teeth, not their hearts. Love was a transaction. Friendship came with contracts. I got tired of pretending it was normal." Ethan waited, not interrupting. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with the strap of her coat. "My name is Lily Carrington," she said, looking out over the field. "My father is Maxwell Carrington. Carrington Technologies. Maybe you've heard of it." Ethan blinked. The name rang familiar, if distant. Headlines, magazine covers, some television interviews he had half listened to once. Billionaire families, corporate empires, nothing that belonged to his world. I wasn't running away from him, she continued. I was running from what he expected me to become. He groomed me to take over, taught me everything except how to be a person. Ethan stared at her, not with disbelief, but with a dawning awareness of how much he hadn't seen, or hadn't wanted to see. Her calm, her poise, the subtle confidence that came from someone who had been in command of rooms far more intimidating than a barn full of hay. It all made sense now. "So what brought you here?" he asked, his tone softer than before. She smiled, but it was thin, weary. "A breakdown, of sorts. My engagement ended. My father called it a public embarrassment and tried to bury it in a PR campaign. I packed a bag and drove, no destination, just away. I ran out of road here." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't feel betrayed. If anything, he felt something settle in him, something that had been restless since the first time she showed up. Her story didn't change what she had done. She had worked beside him, day after day, never asking for special treatment. She had earned her place in that silence they shared. But something else stirred in him now, a worry he hadn't allowed himself to feel. If her name was real, if her father was who she claimed, then it was only a matter of time before someone came looking. The quiet they had built could be shattered in an instant. "Why not tell me sooner?" he asked. "Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be wanted for nothing," she said. "To be needed for who I am, not for what I come from. You gave me that without even realizing it." Ethan looked away. The land stretched before them like a wound waiting to heal. The auction would not wait. No amount of truth changed that. Later that afternoon, while Lily fixed a broken latch on the chicken coop, Ethan climbed into the attic. He hadn't been up there in years, not since his father died. The dust was thick, the air stale with memories. He moved aside boxes, of tools, jars of nails, and yellowed documents until he found what he wasn't looking for, a wooden crate marked with his mother's handwriting. Inside were keepsakes, photos, letters, small objects of no real value, but filled with meaning. He pulled out a faded envelope, addressed to him in her careful script. It must have been written years ago, tucked away before she passed. He unfolded it carefully. The words struck him harder than expected. "My dear Ethan, I hope you never need to read this, but if you do, I want you to remember something. Our land is a gift, not a burden. But your heart, that is the true legacy. Don't let pride rob you of what matters. Let yourself be loved. Let yourself accept help. We survived because we leaned on one another, not because we stood alone." The handwriting wavered near the end, a smudge where a tear had once fallen. Ethan stared at it, the silence in the attic pressing in around him. His mother's words reached deeper than any debt collector ever could. They echoed every stubborn decision he had made, every refusal to accept kindness, every step away from the one person who had offered him something real. He climbed down from the attic slowly, the letter folded in his hand. Outside, Lily was still working, sleeves rolled up, face smudged with dirt, her expression peaceful. She didn't see him watching her, but for the first time Ethan looked at her without fear. Not of who she was or where she came from, but of what she represented. A second chance. A chance he hadn't earned, maybe, but one he no longer wanted to reject. And yet time was not on his side. The farm would be gone tomorrow. The morning fog clung to the earth like a secret, curling low over the fields and swallowing the horizon in pale grey. Ethan heard the car before he saw it, a hum too smooth, too polished to belong to anyone local. No one from town drove, something that quiet or that expensive, and no one from around here came this far without a reason. He stepped out of the barn, hands still coated in oil from fixing the old generator, and walked slowly to the porch. A sleek black car rolled to a stop at the end of the drive, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. The doors opened with a deliberate grace, and a tall man stepped out, lean, sharply dressed, with brown hair combed back and a coat that looked like it belonged in a boardroom rather than a field. He carried a slim briefcase. His boots were spotless. Ethan didn't move. He just watched, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. The man approached with the confidence of someone used to owning rooms, and expecting to be listened to. "You must be Ethan Miller," he said, removing his sunglasses. "Depends who's asking," Ethan replied flatly. "Grant Huxley," the man said, extending a hand that Ethan didn't take. "I'm here on behalf of the Carrington family." That name settled in the air between them like a weight. Grant didn't flinch. "I believe you know Lily." Ethan said nothing. "She's been off the grid, let's say, and certain people are very concerned about her well-being." "She's fine," Ethan said. "And she's not missing. She's exactly where she wants to be." Grant gave a thin smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. This place, while charming in its own way, is hardly fitting for someone of Lily's background. She can decide that for herself. "Of course," Grant said, voice smooth. "But sometimes people forget who they are, where they come from when they're trying to escape. I'm simply here to help her remember." He opened his briefcase with a soft click and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is a generous offer," he said, "in exchange for your cooperation." Ethan didn't even glance at it. "You think I care about your money?" "I think anyone would in your situation." Ethan took a step forward. "You come out here in your tailored coat and shiny shoes, thinking you can throw cash at a man's life like it's a bad investment. This isn't a negotiation." "You're proud, I respect that," Grant said, undeterred. "But pride doesn't pay debts, and it doesn't protect Lily either." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "She doesn't need protecting from me." "No," Grant said, slipping the envelope back into his case, "just from herself." Before Ethan could speak again, a voice cut through the air. "Grant!" They both turned. Lily was walking up from the side of the barn, a toolbox in, her hand and fire in her eyes. She stopped a few feet away, shoulders squared. "You shouldn't be here," she said, voice cold. "You shouldn't be here," Grant echoed more softly. "Your mother is worried sick. Your father is furious. This isn't a game, Lily. You don't get to disappear." "I'm not disappearing. I'm living." Grant stepped toward Yeo, his tone tightening. "With him? That's none of your business. It's every bit my business. You left without a word. You embarrassed your family. And now you're playing house on a broken-down farm?" Lily placed the toolbox on the ground and crossed her arms. "You don't get to shame me. Not after what you did. This," she gestured at the land around them, "is the first thing that's felt real in years." Grant glanced at Ethan, then back at her. "He doesn't belong in your world." "Maybe I don't belong in that world anymore either. Your future was mapped out. You were going to lead Carrington Technologies. You were going to marry me. I was going to become my father's puppet and your trophy. I chose not to." Grant's voice dropped, dangerous now. "You'll regret this." "No," she said, tearing the envelope from his briefcase. "I regret staying silent for so long." She ripped it in half, then again, until the papers fluttered like dying leaves in the wind. "Now leave." Grant's mouth twitched. But he didn't argue. He adjusted his coat, turned back to the car and got in without another word. The engine purred to life, and the vehicle rolled down the drive, vanishing into the fog as swiftly as it had come. Silence filled the space he left behind. Ethan turned to Lily. "You okay?" She nodded, but her hands were shaking. "I'm sorry you had to see that." "I'm not. I thought I was done with him, with that life." "Sometimes it comes looking for you anyway." She exhaled long and low. "I need a minute." Ethan watched as she walked away, slow and steady. He didn't stop her. For the first time since she arrived, Lily didn't come back the next day. The next morning broke in silence. The usual pattern had been broken, and Ethan felt it like a missing step on a familiar staircase. Lily wasn't there. No footsteps on the gravel, no voice calling out from the barn, no quiet laughter drifting through the morning mist. It was strange how quickly he had grown used to her presence, how much space she had come to occupy in his day without ever demanding it. She had filled the silence of the farm without making a sound. Now the quiet returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Ethan went about his tasks like a man walking underwater. Feed for Jasper. Fence line check. A busted hinge on the chicken coop door. Everything was routine, yet everything felt wrong. By noon, He was sitting on the porch, turning the folded letter from his mother over in his hand, the paper worn, soft at the corners. He read it again, tracing her words with his thumb, letting them settle deeper this time. Pride had its place, but it didn't plant fields or build futures. Love did. Community did. Humility too. He stood, not entirely sure what he planned to do, only that sitting still wouldn't bring Lily back or save the farm. Something had to change. He couldn't keep waiting for miracles or hiding from the truth. She had shown him that. By afternoon, Ethan had hitched up Jasper and was riding into town. It had been weeks since he'd gone farther than the local feed store. Now he passed the town square, where the notice board had already been pinned with flyers announcing the auction. Miller Farm, 200 acres, equipment, structures, livestock. Public sale to occur at noon the next day. He stopped in front of the diner and tied Jasper to the old post out front. Inside, the familiar smells of fried food and coffee filled the air. A few locals glanced up when he entered. He nodded at them, ignoring the whispers that always came when they thought he wasn't listening. This time, he didn't care. He found Janet, the waitress who had been serving at the counter since his father's time. "You still have that flyer about the organic initiative?" he asked her. She raised an eyebrow but reached under the counter and handed him a copy. It was a local government program offering seed funding and infrastructure support for sustainable farming practices. Ethan had dismissed it before, thinking it wasn't for people like him. People with aging equipment and barely functioning. Irrigation lines. But maybe it was time to stop deciding what he was and start figuring out what he could still become. He left the diner with the flyer in hand and rode back home with a new determination he hadn't felt in years. That evening, he stood at the edge of the fallow wheat field, soil dry and cracked under his boots. With a shovel in one hand and the wind tugging at his jacket, he began to dig. Not because it would change anything overnight, but because it had to start somewhere. He turned over a strip of earth, then another, moving down the row with slow, steady rhythm. The soil beneath wasn't dead, just tired, like him. The sound of footsteps behind him made him pause. "You planning to plant something in the middle of October?" Lily's voice was soft but unmistakable. Ethan straightened and turned to find her standing a few feet away, hands in her coat pockets, wind in her hair. She looked tired, but less guarded. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she replied. "But then I saw the flyers around town, and I knew I couldn't leave things like this." Ethan stepped closer, brushing dirt from his hands. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not listening? Sooner? For shutting you out? For acting like this place meant more than you did?" Lily looked at him for a long moment. "You're allowed to fight for your land. I just didn't want you to fight alone." "I've been alone a long time," he said, "and maybe I got used to it, but you—" He stopped, unsure how to say the next part. She waited. "You made things feel possible again." Lily stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Then let me help." "I can't take your money," he said quickly. "I'm not offering money," she replied. "Not today." He nodded, heart thudding. "Then stay. Help me plant something, even if it doesn't grow." They spent the next hours side by side, turning over the earth in quiet partnership. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The work became a kind of language, simple, honest, unspoken. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in strokes of fire, Ethan showed her the flyer. "I thought maybe this could be something, if I survive the auction." Lily read it carefully, then looked up at him. "You won't be alone tomorrow. Whatever happens, I'll be there." And as they stood together in the twilight, the field behind them freshly turned and waiting, Ethan realized that maybe losing the farm wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the start of something else, something he hadn't dared hope for in a long time. The morning of the auction arrived colder than expected. Frost clung to the grass like a warning, and the sky hung low, wrapped in gray silence. Ethan stood at the edge of the porch, a mug of black coffee in his hand, eyes fixed on the dirt road that curved toward the county courthouse. He had barely slept. Every part of his body felt heavy, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he was about to lose. Lily emerged from the barn, bundled in a wool coat, her boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. She stopped beside him without speaking. For a while they stood together, the silence not awkward, but necessary. There were no words to ease. What lay ahead? "They said I have to be there by 11, Ethan murmured. "Just to confirm I'm not contesting anything." Lily nodded. "I'll drive. I appreciate that." They didn't eat breakfast. Neither of them was hungry. The drive into town was quiet, the truck's old heater rattling as it fought against the cold. The closer they got to the courthouse, the more real it became. Ethan could feel it in the way his chest tightened, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel even after he had agreed to let Lily drive. Downtown was already busy when they arrived. Cars lined the streets and people milled around the courthouse steps like they were gathering for a parade instead of a public auction. Most of them were strangers, developers, lawyers, investors, from out of town. A few familiar faces stood among them, townsfolk who had watched the rise and slow fall of the Miller farm with distant sympathy. Ethan recognized the bank representative, Mark Lewis, standing near the doors. Mark gave him a short nod. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. Inside the courthouse chamber, the temperature was no better. The walls were beige, the floors linoleum, and the lighting harsh in a way that stripped even the most composed faces of their color. A clerk read off procedures in a monotone voice, calling names, parcel numbers, and starting bids. The farm was fourth on the list. Ethan sat in a chair near the back. Lily sat beside him, her posture calm, hands clasped in her lap. She hadn't said much on the way, and now her silence was even more deliberate. She was letting him own the moment, but he could feel her presence, solid beside him. When his name was called, he stood. The clerk confirmed the terms, property to be auctioned for debt settlement, bidding to begin immediately. Ethan said nothing. He just nodded once and sat down. The auctioneer read out the details. 200 acres. A family farm, outbuildings, equipment, one registered livestock animal. Opening bid, 130,000. The room was still for a second. Then a man in a grey suit raised a numbered paddle. 130, he said. Do I hear 135? Another paddle. 135. Ethan stared at the floor. He recognized none of the bidders. These weren't farmers. They were investors. People who would flip the land or split it up for housing developments. The idea of bulldozers cutting into the earth where his grandfather once planted corn made him feel physically sick. 40, someone said. 45. 50. Lily leaned slightly toward him. Ethan, listen. He looked at her. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered. I can stop this, she whispered. He knew what she meant. She had the means. One phone call, one transfer, and the auction would end. But he shook his head. Not like this. Why? She asked, nearly breaking. Because it has to be my choice, he said. I have to lose it if I'm going to earn anything again. The auctioneer continued, voice rising. 175, 180, 185. Do I hear 190? Ethan felt something shift. A strange quiet overtook the room. 190 going once. Lily's breath caught beside him. Going twice. Ethan closed his eyes. Sold for 185,000. The gavel hit the block like a gunshot, and just like that it was over. Outside, the cold air struck harder than before. Ethan walked slowly to the truck, not because his legs were weak, but because something in him had been torn out and left behind in that room. Lily followed, silent, until the doors of the cab closed. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. He stared at the dashboard, fingers resting on the keys. It's not your fault, he said. It was already gone, I just hadn't let go. You don't have to face this alone, she said. I know, he replied, and he meant it. They didn't go home immediately. Instead, they drove out to the edge of the property, to a spot where the fence dipped and the field stretched. Far into the west, Ethan got out and walked into the field, his boots crunching through frost-kissed grass. This used to be wheat, he said. Every June it looked like fire under the sunset. Now it's just dirt. "It's still yours," Lily said, stepping beside him. He shook his head. "Not anymore." Lily turned to him, eyes fierce. "Maybe not on paper, but this place remembers you, and no matter what happens next, you are not finished." He looked at her and something inside him cracked, not from pain, from release. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. "We'll figure it out," she said. And for the first time since it all began, he believed her. The air inside the farmhouse was still. No wind passed through the windows, no sound echoed from the barn. It was a silence Ethan hadn't heard in years. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that settles into bones and stays there. The farm was no longer his. The fields beyond the porch didn't belong to the Miller name anymore. Yet, he moved through each room as though they did, still waking early, still checking on Jasper, still keeping the routines that had formed the foundation of his life. Lily had stayed. She didn't press him with questions or ideas, just offered her presence in the soft, unwavering way she always had. She made coffee in the mornings. She walked the fence line with him in the evenings. She never spoke about the auction. She never once said, "I told you so." And that was what kept him from breaking. That quiet respect. On the third day after the auction, Ethan climbed to the attic. He hadn't been up there since he'd found his mother's letter. Dust coated the old floorboards, and the single window leaked a narrow shaft of light. He moved boxes aside, not looking for anything in particular, maybe just chasing the idea of memory, of meaning. A crate near the far wall caught his attention. It was marked with faded ink, the name Henry Miller, etched across the front, his grandfather. He knelt beside it and opened the lid. Inside were notebooks, brittle with age, filled with ledger entries, crop rotations, rainfall logs. Beneath them, wrapped in cloth, was a smaller box. Inside that, a bundle of letters tied with string. The top letter bore a date from over 40 years ago. It was addressed to Henry, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. Ethan untied the bundle and began to read. What unfolded in those pages was a part of his family history he had never known. They were letters from a man named Joseph Carrington, a name that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He read quickly, scanning for context. The letters spoke of a land deal that had nearly happened. Joseph had wanted to purchase the Miller property decades ago, back when Ethan's grandfather had fallen behind on taxes, but Henry had refused. Instead, Joseph had offered something else, a partnership. He wanted to invest in Henry's farm, not own it, but support a new kind of agriculture. They discussed sustainable methods, rotating crops, water conservation, ideas ahead of their time. But Henry had declined, too proud to accept money from a businessman, even one with good intentions. Ethan sat back on his heels, stunned. The name wasn't just familiar because of Lily. Joseph Carrington had been her grandfather. He flipped to the last letter. The tone was regretful, almost mournful. Joseph had written, "If not for your stubbornness, I believe we could have changed more than a patch of earth. I hope one day your family understands that partnerships don't erase legacies, they build them." Ethan stared at the words, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The past had circled back, not just in memories, but in flesh and blood. Lily wasn't just a woman who had wandered onto his land. She was connected to its history in ways neither of them had realized. He climbed down from the attic slowly, holding the bundle of letters as if they might break. Lily was outside, tending to Jasper, brushing his coat with long, even strokes. She looked up as Ethan stepped out, the sun catching the edge of her hair. "I found something," he said. She watched his face, cautious. "What is it?" He handed her the bundle. "Your grandfather. He wrote these to mine." She took them gently, reading the top one. As her eyes moved down the page, her breath caught. "He wanted to help your family," she asked. Ethan nodded. "He tried. My grandfather refused. Too proud, like me." Lily sat on the porch steps, flipping through the letters. "I didn't know any of this. My father never talked about him much." Ethan sat beside her. "It makes sense now why you ended up here, why this place felt right to you." She looked at him. "Maybe it was never random." "No," Ethan said. "Maybe it was part of something bigger than both of us." They spent the rest of the day sorting through the letters, trying to piece together what could have been. Each line Joseph had written revealed a man who believed in the land, in reinvention, in community. Ethan began to see his grandfather not as a relic of another time, but as a man who had made choices in fear, in pride, and ultimately in isolation. That evening, Lily sat at the table, surrounded by old maps and journals. She was quiet, her focus sharp, her expression thoughtful. Joseph had plans, she said, real plans. He wanted to create a model for sustainable farming before anyone else was doing it. Ethan nodded. And it could still work, if someone picked up where he left off. Lily looked at him. You mean us? I mean, if the Carrington name still carries weight, if there's any part of that vision still alive, maybe it's worth trying. She smiled, slow and genuine. I'll make a call. Not for a handout, Ethan said quickly. Not to get the farm back just because your name can open doors. I know, she said, but maybe this time we don't have to do it alone. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something stir in his chest that wasn't pain or fear or guilt. It was the start of hope. The courthouse had been empty for over a week, yet Ethan found himself walking its front steps once again. Not for an auction, not for a signature or a form, but because something in him needed to stand where he had once fallen, to face the final echo of his loss and decide what came next. The wind tugged at his coat as he stood under the archway, the town silent behind him. He wasn't waiting for justice or reversal. He was waiting for courage. Behind him, the sound of hooves on pavement broke the stillness. Jasper approached at a gentle trot, Lily in the saddle, the reins loose in her hands. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no emblem of the wealth she had walked away from. Her coat was dusty. Her boots were stained with earth. She looked like she belonged on the horse on the land, not as a visitor, but as someone who had finally chosen where she wanted to be. She dismounted and tied Jasper to the old rail near the stairs. You weren't at the house, she said simply. I needed to see it again, Ethan replied, to feel what it cost me and what I'm willing to do about it. Lily walked beside him to the courthouse steps. For a long moment they stood without speaking. After I made that call, she said, my father reached out. He wanted to know where I was, what I planned to do. Ethan looked at her, guarded. I told him I found something real, she said, and that I wouldn't trade it for any amount of board seats or shares. He nodded slowly. Did he listen? Not at first. But then he asked me one question. Do you love him? The words dropped between them like seeds waiting to root. Ethan's throat tightened. And what did you say? She looked at him, eyes steady. I said yes. The breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped him like a flood. But before he could answer, she added, but it's not just about that. I didn't stay here just for you. I stayed because this place, this land, this life, it makes sense to me in a way nothing else ever has. I want to build something here with you if you'll let me. Ethan turned toward her fully and for the first time let his guard fall completely. I was afraid, he said, afraid that needing you would make me weak, that accepting your help would mean I'd failed. But I realized losing the farm wasn't what broke me. It was pushing away the only person who offered to stand in the wreckage with me. Lily stepped closer. Then let's stop talking about what we lost and start building what we still have. He took a deep breath, reached into his coat, and pulled out Jasper's reins. He held them out to her, not as an offer of transportation, but as a gesture, a symbol. Ride back with me, he said, not as a Carrington, not as a guest, but as the woman who made my broken world bloom again. Lily looked down at the reins, then up at him. Slowly, she took them. Her hand brushed his, and something in the air shifted, not like lightning, but like a slow sunrise over land that had waited too long for light. I will, she said, but we're doing it our way. No shortcuts, no last names opening doors, just soil, sweat, and second chances. They mounted Jasper together, awkwardly but laughing, and began the slow ride back through the heart of the town, past faces that peered from windows and storefronts. No one shouted, no one pointed. But the whispers would come later. Ethan didn't care. Neither did Lily. As the town faded behind them, the fields opened up before them, bare, uncertain, but waiting. That evening, with the sun low behind the hills, Ethan walked the land with Lily at his side. They talked about crops, irrigation, and ideas far bolder than what had ever been planted in that soil before. She shared the details of the sustainable agriculture fund her grandfather once proposed. Ethan showed her the ledger where his father had tracked rainfall by hand for decades. Together, they imagined a version of the farm reborn, not in the image of what it had been, but in what it could become. They stopped at the edge of the southern field where the soil was softest. Ethan knelt, pushed his hand into the earth and smiled. "We start here," he said. Lily crouched beside him. "With what?" "With whatever grows next." As the stars blinked into the sky one by one, they stood together, the cold forgotten, the past acknowledged but no longer in control. They had not fixed everything, but they had chosen to begin. 3 weeks passed. In that time, the land began to change. It wasn't dramatic, no sweeping fields of green or shiny new equipment, but subtle, quiet progress. The kind Ethan had learned to appreciate. He and Lily mapped the fields by hand, testing soil, clearing brush, repairing what was salvageable. They drafted plans late into the night, scribbled on napkins and scrap paper, sketched over the kitchen table under the weak light of a dangling bulb. The ideas weren't extravagant, but they were theirs. An organic produce co-op, a compost system, rotating grazing patterns for sustainable livestock. It wasn't a return to the past, it was the start of something new. They worked together like they had always known how. Disagreements came, but they never broke the rhythm they were building. Lily didn't act like someone who had left a fortune behind. She acted like a partner, shoulder to shoulder in mud and sweat, never above any task. It humbled Ethan in ways words couldn't reach, and yet there was a tension lingering beneath it all. Ethan couldn't name it at first, just a flicker in Lily's expression whenever they talked about long-term investments, about deeds, about legal ownership. She deflected easily, never with a lie, just with a redirection that felt too smooth. He tried not to question it. She had earned his trust, but something in her eyes, a hesitation he couldn't ignore, told him that a truth was waiting. It came one afternoon when the mail arrived with a thick envelope from the county. Ethan opened it with the usual expectation of some utility notice or permit form. What he found instead was a property record, and his name was on it. At first he thought it was a mistake. Then he read it again. The Miller farm, 200 acres, structures, outbuildings, had been purchased through a private trust. The trust had then transferred the title directly into Ethan's name. There was no mortgage attached, no conditions, just a sealed transaction and a recorded deed. He stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. Then he turned the envelope over, looking for any clue. In the corner, a small embossed seal, Carrington Family Holdings. He didn't go inside, he didn't call out. He walked instead, past the barn, past the old windmill, past the ridge where the soil turned rocky. He found Lily in the lower field, kneeling beside a broken irrigation line, hands in the dirt. She looked up, smiled. "I think we can fix this valve without replacing it." He didn't smile back. He held out the papers. She took them without a word, scanned them and exhaled. Not in fear, in relief. "I was going to tell you," she said softly. "You bought the farm," Ethan said, his voice flat. "I bought it through a trust, quietly, after the auction. I didn't want to interfere with your choice, but I couldn't let it go to strangers. I waited until you were ready to try again, then I transferred it to you." Ethan took a step back. "You said we'd do it together, that there'd be no shortcuts." "This wasn't a shortcut," she said. "It was a safety net. You were drowning, Ethan, and I wasn't going to watch you lose everything again." He shook his head, the weight of the gesture heavier than it looked. "You lied." "I protected something you love," she replied. "And yes, I waited. Because you needed to fight. You needed to fail on your own terms. But when you were ready to rebuild, I made sure there was something left to rebuild on. The silence that followed was jagged. Ethan looked away, jaw clenched. You made a choice for me. No, she said, stepping closer. I made a choice with you in mind, and then I gave it back. That's what love looks like sometimes. He didn't answer right away. He turned, staring out across the field. The land looked the same, but it wasn't. It was his again, not because of grit or luck, but because someone believed in him more than he had believed in himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Why didn't you tell me the moment you did it? Because I was afraid, Lily said, not of you hating me, but of you not forgiving yourself. He let the words settle, then turned back to her. I don't know how to feel. You don't have to, she said, not yet, just don't shut me out. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the daughter of wealth or legacy, not the woman who had once disappeared into a storm on Jasper's back, but the partner who had stood by him through ruin and quiet and rebuilding. I can't pay you back, he said. I'm not asking for anything, she replied, except maybe a place in whatever you build next. He stepped forward, slowly. Then it has to be ours. Not mine, not yours, ours. She nodded once, eyes never leaving his, and with that the fracture between them mended. Later that night, as they sat on the porch with tired hands and sore backs, Ethan read the deed again. This time it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a foundation. The land beneath them was no longer a battlefield of memory and pride. It was a promise, and this time, they were keeping it together. The days that followed weren't miraculous. There were no grand announcements, no sudden fortune, no news articles praising the revival of the Miller farm. Instead, what came was something quieter and in many ways far more meaningful: routine. Simple, sacred routine. Ethan and Lily rose early before the sun, just as the sky began to hint at morning. The porch light flicked on, the coffee brewed slow and strong, and the boots went on with the same weight and purpose every day. They worked from dawn to dusk, side by side. They didn't just repair the land, though they reimagined it. The old barn, once leaning and skeletal, was shored up and painted with fresh coats of red. Inside, they cleaned out every forgotten corner, restored old tools, and repurposed wood beams for new shelving. The tractor still sputtered now and then, but it moved, and that was enough. Lily, to Ethan's surprise, had a natural touch with machinery. She'd grown up around developers and engineers, and some of it had stuck. She could read a blueprint as well as he could read the sky. The southern field, the one Ethan had once given up on, was the first to show new life. With compost and care, the soil began to loosen. Rows of winter vegetables, spinach, kale, carrots, onions, were planted in tidy rows, protected by hand-built barriers from deer and rabbits. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something, and something was more than nothing. Together, they also drafted their application for the county's Sustainable Farming Initiative. Lily did the legal work, navigating the documentation like a seasoned pro, while Ethan provided the voice of the land, the data, the patterns, the historical records from his grandfather's journals. The plan wasn't just to farm organically, but to build a model that could serve other small farms, a local collective, shared resources, and mutual resilience. The neighbors noticed. Slowly, they began to stop by. First, it was Mrs. Harlan, from 3 properties over, who dropped off an extra pie and stayed for coffee. Then came Jacob, a quiet man in his 60s who offered to loan an old post-hole digger when he saw them fencing. Word spread, not because they asked for help, but because people respected what they were doing, not restoring the past, but investing in a future. And Ethan changed too, not in some dramatic or sudden way, but the tightness in his shoulders eased. He laughed more, real unguarded laughter that cracked through his usual stillness like sunlight through old clouds. He spoke about ideas. He no longer held his breath when the mail came or avoided town out of shame. He stood taller, not because he had reclaimed the land, but because he had allowed someone else to believe in it, and in him, when he couldn't. Lily, for her part, grew into the space between the rows and rafters as though she had always belonged there. She never missed a day. She never backed away from the dirty work. But more than that, she became part of the land's story. Not an outsider who came to escape, but a woman who came to root herself in something real. They learned each other's rhythms, when to speak, when to stay quiet. When Ethan needed a moment alone by the east fence. When Lily needed to call her mother and not talk about what was said afterward. They didn't try to fix each other. They simply stayed present, through rain, through broken tools, through small victories. One Saturday afternoon, while fixing the last gate on the pasture fence, Ethan looked up and saw a familiar figure standing by the driveway. Mark Lewis, the bank representative who had overseen the auction. He held a clipboard, but his face wasn't cold like before. "I'm not here on business," Mark said, stepping forward. "Just thought I'd stop by. Been hearing things." Ethan nodded warily. "What kind of things?" "That you're turning this place around," Mark said. "That something's happening here." Ethan glanced at Lily, who gave a polite nod. "We're trying." Mark smiled. "Well, if you need anything, advice on the co-op model, contacts at the ag department, give me a call. I grew up on a farm myself. I'd like to see one make it." It wasn't much, but it was something, a small signal that the tide had shifted, not just in the soil, but in the perception of what was possible. That evening, they sat on the porch as the last light faded. The sky was painted with soft blues and purples, and Jasper stood peacefully in the paddock, chewing at the grass with calm indifference. Ethan held a mug of tea, not coffee, for the first time in his life, and Lily was wrapped in an old quilt she had found in the attic and refused to throw away. "We're getting there," she said. "We are," Ethan agreed. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we hadn't met?" "I try not to," he said, "because it scares me." She smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "You don't scare easy." "I used to, every day, but now it's different." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the kind of silence that comes when there is nothing left to prove and everything to look forward to. There were still debts to pay, fences to mend, paperwork to file, and weeds to pull. The barn roof still leaked on the north side. The chickens were getting into the garden again. Nothing was perfect, but the foundation had been laid, and it was strong. The morning of the festival broke clear and cold, the sky the kind of brilliant blue that only appears in late autumn when the air is dry and sharp. The Miller farm was alive in a way it hadn't been in decades. Laughter echoed from the barn. The smell of bread and chili drifted from the kitchen, and children ran through the fields with straw stuck to their jackets and faces full of curiosity. It was the first harvest celebration held on the property since Ethan's father passed away. And though the wheat hadn't grown high and the vegetables were still modest in their yield, the celebration wasn't about abundance. It was about return. Ethan stood near the porch, watching as a group of volunteers arranged folding tables under the bare-limbed oak trees. Colorful quilts had been draped across the tabletops. Homemade jars of pickles, preserves, and apple butter sat beside pies, and loaves of bread, each one bearing a handwritten label. The community had shown up, not just out of politeness, but with energy, with presence. Some came with instruments, others with nothing more than a desire to help. No one asked about money. No one talked about who owned what. They were there for something deeper. Lily emerged from the barn carrying a small basket of late-season carrots, their orange skin still streaked with dirt. Her hair was tied back with a red scarf, and her boots were scuffed from days of walking the rows. She wore the land now, not like a costume, but like a second skin. She spotted Ethan and smiled, not the tentative smile she once gave him, but one full of ease, full of knowing. He met her halfway and took the basket from her hands. "You've been busy," he said. "So have you," she replied. "The place looks incredible." "It looks like it belongs to someone who never gave up." Lily raised an eyebrow. "You didn't." "I did," he said. "But then someone reminded me that giving up and letting go aren't the same thing." She stepped closer. "And what did you let go of?" "The idea that I had to do everything alone, that accepting help was the same as failing." A breeze passed between them, cool and clean. She touched his arm. "I think this place needed both of us." He nodded. "And now it has more." They looked around. Children played tag near the chicken coop. teens danced awkwardly to an old fiddle tune. Elderly neighbors sat beneath the shade of the porch, sipping cider from tin cups and sharing stories Ethan had never heard. The land was still tired, still healing, but it was no longer empty. Mark Lewis was there too, standing near the west fence with a clipboard under one arm, talking to a young man about co-op logistics. Ethan had invited him. Not because he needed a banker, but because he respected the man who had shown up again with no transaction in mind. A few reporters had come as well, not from the city, but local folks who ran the town paper, curious to see how a bankrupt farm had become a symbol of resilience. One woman asked Ethan if she could take his picture next to the barn. He agreed, but only if Lily stood beside him. As the sun lowered and the afternoon waned into golden hour, Ethan stood near the center of the gathering. He tapped a glass gently with a spoon and waited as the crowd quieted. "I wasn't sure I was going to say anything," he began, voice steady, "but then I looked around and I saw people who knew my family, who knew this land long before. It almost got swallowed. I saw new faces, old friends, neighbors who came not to remember what we lost, but to celebrate what we're building. So, I guess I just want to say thank you." He paused, glancing at Lily. "This farm isn't perfect. It's got broken things and weeds that won't quit. But it's ours again, not just mine, ours, and it's stronger because we didn't try to rebuild it alone." There was quiet applause, not the forced kind, but the soft, heartfelt kind. Ethan stepped down and returned to Lily's side. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit and strung from the barn to the trees. Music carried over the fields. Couples danced barefoot in the grass. Children dozed in their parents' laps, wrapped in quilts. Jasper stood calmly near the fence, his head low, tail swishing. The land glowed not with wealth but with warmth. Later that night, after the last table was cleared and the fire pits burned low, Ethan and Lily walked the perimeter of the property, hand in hand. The stars above them shimmered without apology. The fields stretched out in every direction, no longer empty but expectant. "I was thinking," Ethan said, his voice thoughtful, "about calling it something new." Lily looked at him. "The farm? Yeah, we've planted enough roots of our own. Maybe it's time it had a new name." "What would you call it?" He thought for a long moment, then smiled. "Second Acre." Lily tilted her head. "Why?" "Because the first one was built on tradition. This one was built on choice." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I like that." And in the stillness that followed, neither of them spoke again. They didn't have to. The bankrupt farmer who once gave away his last horse had found something far richer. Not just love, not just partnership, but purpose. And in the quiet on the land that nearly slipped away, he built something lasting, not with money, but with belief. And the harvest they now shared had nothing to do with crops. It had everything to do with hope.